It's my absolute pleasure to be speaking with Anders Puck Nielsen again, military analyst and influential YouTuber based in Denmark. He specializes in naval warfare and strategy, and in today's video, we're going to be covering a whole range of topics from the 5% defense increase that NATO has announced for its member states, and we're going to be talking about the suspected withdrawal of supplies of various types of munitions by the US to Ukraine. Before we jump into that, I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who supports Anders' channel and, of course, who supports mine. Make sure you are subscribed. Less than 50% of people watching these videos are actually subscribed to the channel, and you really risk missing out on some of the great materials and guests that we publish. Thank you also to everybody who's become a patron or bought me a coffee. It is immensely helpful. It really, really is. Now, let's get into the episode. Anders, welcome back.
Well, thanks for having me back. It's always a pleasure.
Always, always. And we never have, unfortunately, a dearth of things to discuss. And we're talking in a very active week. It's just been sort of announced by various US media sources that Eldridge Colby, a senior official in the Pentagon, one of Trump's sort of inner circle, and someone who has a very narrow America first view of American foreign policy focused on China almost exclusively, has announced that they're withdrawing all sorts or cancelling all sorts of munition types to Ukraine, including 155 ammunition artillery shells. We've got munitions for the Patriot systems, and there's a whole list of others. What's your immediate reaction to that before we get into the sort of strategic implications?
The big perspective is just it shows how Europe cannot rely on the Trump administration for this. It's time after time they seem to be doing things that benefit Russia, and sometimes they will sharpen the rhetoric about it. It will appear that Trump is really angry with Putin about something. There was just the NATO summit last week where Trump said some things that could be interpreted as being forthcoming toward Ukraine, and maybe now would be different, but then it's just words. And then comes this, and obviously, it's exactly what Putin would be wishing for. And I don't think it's going to change, the frontline situation all that much. I mean, Ukraine will be able to hold the front line, I think, more or less the same way as they are now, because the most important weapons out there are drones that are mostly produced in Ukraine, and of course other types of weapons as well that Ukraine gets from other sources. But it will unfortunately mean that Ukraine will be worse off in terms of air defense, defense of Ukrainian cities. There will be more civilian casualties as a result of this, and quite frankly, it just seems evil. I think it's difficult to find words for what the American administration is doing here in terms of withdrawing this ammunition that is so important for the defense of Ukrainian cities at a time when Russian airstrikes are bigger than ever before. So again, it shows really that Europe has to start, acting independently and taking the leadership on this. That probably the approach last week at the summit, where it was all about flattering Donald Trump and calling him daddy and all those things, like that approach is not working, because he's not delivering on the things that are necessary for European security. So why do it? Why play this game where it looks like we are so dependent on the United States that we can't do anything on our own? On the contrary, I think it would have been better to speak up, like talk about how Europe is great and can actually do things to try to create that atmosphere of strategic independence.
And that's challenging, isn't it? Because the UK pushed for this 5% to be delayed as long as possible. I know the UK government have some real issues in the post-Brexit world. I would also argue issues in leadership and vision. And we wanted to push this 5% out to 2035, which in the current world, it's almost impossible to imagine that far ahead, whereas the threat is absolutely immediate. And of course, the threat to Ukrainian civilians is immediate. So, what's going to be the direct implication here? Trump withdraws these munitions. At the same time, we see North Korean workers potentially, it's rumored to be around 20,000 engineers are being sent to Russia to help to scale up the drone facilities. They're no longer dependent on Iran. They've got Iranian designs, but they're no longer dependent on Iran for the components, we believe. And they can manufacture this with their North Korean ally. It seems it seems that the US move almost exactly dovetails with the Russian strategy, which is to create a blitz type atmosphere by smashing Ukrainian cities with ever increasing amounts of ordnance nightly.
Yeah, I mean, lots of things to unpack in what you just said there. I think you are right. I mean, it shows that Donald Trump ultimately wants to be aligned with Russia in this. I mean, ideologically, that's that he feels more. He there is more in Russia than that he likes than in Europe. Um, that does not mean that he will ultimately, in the end, necessarily do what is good for Russia. He might be, there are political circumstances that will limit his ability to do all kinds of things, and he might be forced into one way or another putting sanctions on Russia or delivering more weapons to Ukraine. Just something as simple as being relevant. That if the United States cuts away all the assistance to Ukraine, and it's clear that there will not be any more, then the United States loses relevance, and people will stop talking with Donald Trump because why would they be talking with him when he's not delivering anything? So, there might be things that would mean that these things would come back, but it does show that it's really hard for the Europeans to count them on the US. And then the question of why is it that we see European countries also then being slow to increase the defense budgets? I think many European countries still have this idea that this is a temporary crisis. We just have to get beyond Donald Trump, and then on the other side of this, there will be some kind of normalization. There will be another U.S. president who looks at it differently, and unfortunately, I think that's a miscalculation. I don't think that will be the case, and either way, I don't see how Europe again could trust the United States. I mean, we cannot build our security on the assumption that there will always be we will always have the candidate elected that is willing to stand up for us and not the other one, right? So um, Europe just has to take care of this on our own. And if I just may also, now you've said a couple of times this 5% goal. I keep on insisting that it's a 3.5% goal. The last 1.5%, the way I see it, it's this 3.5 core defense spending, 1.5 on defense related whatever. Um, so the way I see that, those 1.5% is probably something that every state could go out right now and find somewhere in the budget and say, this is defense related. We are now at this, right? And that means we're probably within this year or next year going to see Britain come out and say we are now at 4 plus, right? So it's really the 3.5% core defense spending. And I think specifically for Britain, I think it's important to have this discussion that if you want to be one of the great military powers in Europe, you want to be one of the powers that has nuclear weapons, you have this capability, you have aircraft carriers, you have these things. Those things cost money, and you can't be one of those that spent the least in Europe, right? You actually have to spend more than the average in Europe to have that position. I think there is a discussion to be had there in Britain, and I don't really see that reflected in the British defense debate right now.
And one of the challenges, of course, is that we do have the nuclear deterrent. That takes up a huge portion of the budget. So whereas we may even reach that 3.5% target, even without the kind of, let's say, accounting tricks that the Italians are already playing by including a bridge to Sicily as defense spending, So the Brits probably won't do that. The trouble is, how effective is a nuclear deterrent when Russia has realized that you can conduct a kinetic war, a non-nuclear war, and almost it's on a completely different level. The nuclear weapons are not a deterrent for the kind of kinetic aggression that Russia has been unleashing. It seems that we're getting our priorities a little bit muddled up here in Britain.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think I'm probably among those who think that Europe really has a problem when it comes to nuclear deterrence. I think actually nuclear weapons have played a huge role in the war in Ukraine. If Russia did not have nuclear weapons, there's no doubt that we would have stopped that war. We would have seen NATO aircraft all over Ukraine. We would have seen NATO boots on the ground. We do not have that, and that is because of Russian nuclear weapons. It's because of Russian nuclear coercion that has worked. And in any conflict going forward, we should be prepared to deal with nuclear coercion from Russia. And if we can't rely on the United States to provide capabilities that can respond to that, then we need European nuclear weapons. We need more than we have right now. We need, the way I see it, we need Britain to expand the nuclear arsenal. We need Britain to have more delivery systems, more different types of payloads, all kinds of things, so you can meet Russia on all the different steps and match the nuclear coercion that they might be throwing at us. So we actually depend a lot on Britain right now, and because of the non-proliferation regime, it would be a huge problem if other countries such as Poland or Germany start saying, okay, we're going to build this. So I actually think it's great that Britain has nuclear weapons and there is something to build on here. But as you say, we can't have Britain just having nuclear weapons, right? We need Britain to also have a strong conventional army and a navy and all those things. And having nuclear weapons should probably be seen as something that comes on top of 3.5% on conventional forces. Just as I keep talking about the Denmark. I think we've also had this discussion about spending targets and all that. We have the whole Arctic thing going on, which I think would also make sense to say that, okay, we spend whatever the spending target is on European defense, and then on top of that, we would have the Arctic because it just costs extra to have that. Of course, that's not quite how Danish politicians look at it. So, but there are these discussions.
And of course, we talked about previously how, Denmark, Greenland is completely open to more US presidents and bolstering deterrence in that region. It's just that Trump is not going about it in a partnership way. It's more the way of a bully. And you mentioned you mentioned it sort of collectively that Trump was appeased and coddled at the NATO summit. It seems that in the figure of Rutte, you have someone who is perhaps far more concerned with the sort of institutional preservation of NATO, less concerned perhaps with what constitutes effective deterrence. Am I being overly harsh here in seeing NATO as becoming less effective, even while it's touting these extraordinary, victory of getting to this sort of 5% or 3.5% is in reality? Or is NATO also working on effective sort of deterrence alliances, maybe smaller groups of the willing within the overall umbrella of the alliance?
I The first thing I'll say is I think it's important to remember that Mark Rutte is not actually a European politician anymore. He's the Secretary General of NATO. So it is his job to just make everyone in that alliance get along. I actually think it's more the responsibility of the European state leaders to speak for Europe here. And it's been a little strange to see that they just went along with this flattery. I think there are two interpretations to be made. One of them is that, as I said before, that some European states believe that this is a temporary thing. It's just about, holding out until Trump is replaced by someone else, and then there would be a return to normal. I think if that is the motivation, then I think it's really bad. Because that would mean that these European state leaders, they just don't understand the situation we're in, and how serious this is and what is required of them right now. The other interpretation is that this is about winning time. That if there is a too quick withdrawal of American presence and American deterrence in Europe, then that will leave a vacuum. So it's important to extend that American deterrence until the European countries are ready and we see the effects of these increasing defense budgets. And in reality, it's probably a little bit of both. But I think in the second case, if it's just about delaying American withdrawal, then I think it can be defended and saying that okay, I mean, there's a purpose here, and it's being used in a kind of strategic sense. But I don't think it has. I don't think it's really working because it creates this impression in Europe that we are so dependent and unable to take responsibility on our own. And as we can see right now in Ukraine, it doesn't seem to do anything really to keep the Americans engaged.
And Trump's policy itself, if Europe is trying to, you know, adhere to some kind of consensus with the US, we need to also examine what US policies are based on. We sort of understand what the China first one is all about, seeing China as a peer adversary, and that all sort of makes sense to an extent. But totally detaching China and Russia and seeing them as entirely separate problems seems to me to be fundamentally flawed strategically. But also, there's possibly curious thinking behind it, which is Trump may believe that Russia cannot be defeated. If it cannot be defeated, then Ukraine becomes a little bit of an enigma to him. Why are they fighting if the result and the outcome is inevitable? Why are they resisting? I mean, he may not even have any conception of what Russia would do to the Ukrainian population and territory. He may not really have even studied it or internalized what that actually means. He may not actually care. But that fundamental foundational mistake of thinking that Russia is eternal and invincible, do you think that may form part of his thinking and calculations?
I think so. I think that's been driving really much of American policy since the beginning of the war, also in during the Biden administration. I actually think it's a lot of the you can say it's the same misconception that Putin has of the war. Many people have this idea that, eventually Russia will obviously win because they are so much bigger. So I think that's one misconception. Another one is probably that the idea that they can do this reverse Nixon thing. So they can, by cultivating a good relationship with Russia, they would be able to pull Russia away from China's grip, right? Which I also think is just a fantasy. It's never going to happen. There's no way that the Americans could become more important for Russia than China is. But I think there are quite many people in Washington who believe that that might actually be something that could work.
At the same time, I mean, quite a few YouTubers in our community, quite a few analysts who I speak to, who really, really, especially the ones who speak Russian, who keep an eye on some of the sort of dissident materials that are being created, keep an eye on what's happening in Russia. They have been following the St. Petersburg Economic Forum with great interest because here you have Putin saying these extraordinarily deluded, genocidal, imperialistic statements. I mean, he really has said several of these things about, Russian boots and, wherever those boots have been, that is Russian territory. I mean, it's an extraordinary statement because Russian boots have been all over Eastern and Central Europe. They've been all over Germany. They've even been in Paris at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And I think, he does have this in mind, unfortunately. But the economists around Putin are really talking, they're ringing the alarm bells, including some people within the regime who you wouldn't have expected to talk like this. Gref, for instance, they're basically signpointing that the Russian economy is hitting the rocks and there could be some I won't call it a cataclysmic event, but there could be some significant issues such as bank collapses, business collapses, property industry is on the verge of collapse. There's huge defaults in consumer credit, and there's likely to be huge defaults within the property credit market as well. What's your sort of take on that? And then we'll look at what implications that might have for how the war actually ends.
Yeah, my take on it is, first of all, that Putin seems a little detached from, the realities, the discussions that everyone else are having. That he's the only one saying that things are great, and you know, um, you really have to ask yourself: is this because Putin is he lying? Is this some kind of act that he's you know, putting up? Or is this because this is what he's actually being told and this is what he believes? And increasingly, you get the idea that maybe he's not quite in touch with how what the situation actually is. So that's one thing in it. But another one is, I think, in Putin's perspective, then a collapse of the economy does not necessarily mean a collapse of the war effort. And that he believes that there are several things that Russia can still do, several tools in the toolbox that they might use to extend the war, to keep going, to produce things in a different fashion. One of the things, for example, that I like to point to is the way the Russians man the army. This idea of using contract soldiers that get a very big bonus. Obviously, that's a very, very expensive way to run an army. As long as they keep doing that, then that shows that they are not on the limits of what they can do. And I think actually for Ukraine, it should be seen as an important milestone to bring Russia to the point where Putin has to declare another wave of mobilization, and they start recruiting Russian men forcefully against their will, right? But that is a way that Putin can obviously keep the army going for longer if he starts doing that. And I think I think he's willing to do that. So I think in his perspective, as long as they can keep, recruiting with these bonuses and they can afford to do that, then they are not on the limits of what the Russian army can do, and there's still plenty of margin. So that's one thing. I think he's also willing to make the civilian society sacrifice for this cause. This war is the most important thing. That is the most important mission for Russia and for him, and whatever that requires of ordinary Russians in terms of suffering and sacrifice, that's their duty. That's their duty to the motherland. Um, so, and I also think just in some sense that Putin is just, he's grown up in the Soviet system and the Soviet planned economy, and he also sees that as something that if prices go up indefinitely, we're just gonna at some point just nationalize this thing and dictate what the prices are. Like that is my impression when I see Putin, and that he actually, in his mind, it's not that bad because there's still plenty of margins and things that they can do.
And he knows that he hasn't gone full Stalin yet. He's still got that card to play that when everything seems to run out and the market economy fully breaks down, well, he knows they can go full Soviet, they can go full red terror, as it were. He still has that card to play. And I think it's instructive that the people who are freaking out are the so-called liberal economists. They are oligarchs who miss their villas in Italy and their yachts and this kind of stuff. Do you think he still is feared enough that no one's really going to make a move against him at this point? And how bad would it have to get for there to be some kind of consensus to turn on him?
Yeah, in general, I think Putin is, his position is very strong as a leader of Russia. It's hard to see where a rebellion would come from. But of course, it's always hard with these things. Dictatorships look rock solid until suddenly one day they fall, and everyone will say that was obvious. Um, but so, but I think Putin could go a lot further than he has, at least in terms of the elite, and that's also because the elite they're the ones that they rely so much on Putin. Without Putin, they are nothing right now. Um, I think he's genuinely concerned about where the people is. If he was more confident that the people was with him ideologically, then he would not be paying these big bonuses. Then he would be relying on the sort of ideological spirit of the people to volunteer to fight for the motherland and those things, so he wouldn't have to destroy the economy. So um, I think that's his bigger concern, where the people is. And but if this requires more repression to continue the war, then he will be willing to do that, because in his, like, this is what we have to understand, that in Putin's mind, this is a defensive war. And it sounds a little strange to us because we tend to see it as an aggressive war and imperialist project. Russia attack Ukraine. In Putin's perspective, this is a fight for the Russian Empire, the Russia as a great power, and he sees it as a defensive project. And when you're fighting a defensive project, that means if you don't win, then that thing you're fighting for, you lose that. And he sees it as a historic mission to save Russia's great power status, and if he doesn't win now, then Russia will not be a great power anymore. So he has almost endless determination. That's unfortunately my reading of it.
And of course, some people say, well, hang on a second, surely this is about regime survival. But actually, if we look at this in almost a, dare I say it, a Shakespearean sense, Putin may not see the difference. His regime and his personal survival may have been conflated, and probably is conflated, with the things you talk about, the sort of larger nationalistic vision and this idea of Russia not surviving without him. It's an extraordinary level of delusion, but then he's been a dictator for a long time. It's said that if you spend too much time in that kind of position, you tend to lose the plot. Are you starting to detect that he has lost the plot in some sense?
In that sense, absolutely. I mean, this idea that he is Russia, and he absolutely has a wildly distorted view of himself and his own role in history, and also that he does not see that what he's doing right now is going to be counterproductive. That Russia has lost Ukraine now forever. I mean, there is no way that Ukrainians will, once again join the Russian people, as Putin talked about. Well, we're essentially one people, as he said at this forum, right? We're one people, so all of Ukraine is ultimately ours, right? And he sees the Ukrainians and Russians as basically the same. I mean, that's not how they look at it in Ukraine. And this idea of friendship, of nations, this is a strategic blunder in that sense. But he definitely sees his mission as so important that he's fighting for this idea of uniting the Russian peoples, right? And um, yeah, I mean, I think on a daily basis, I would say when Putin is making decisions about something that, okay, now he's going to take some initiative, he's going to do something, then I think he feels pretty safe as the leader of Russia. I think he genuinely feels that he has the country pretty much under control, and that it is his prerogative to decide that now we're going to do this, now we're going to intensify the war, and I'm going to ask people to go to war, and it's their duty to do it. I think where he would really start we would really start seeing this thing about him not distinguishing between the good of Russia and the good of himself, would be if suddenly there is some kind of uprising in Russia and his own position is threatened, I think he would see that as an existential threat for Russia, because in his mind, without him, Russia is not great anymore.
That's it. And people count for little. They are, material to be expended. It's not unknown, however, is it, in history that a war that is largely fought at the battlefield, like the one we are seeing, a war that is about the ability of countries to marshal resources and production to keep that battlefield going, almost it appears as stasis, but there's a furious amount of, you know, innovation of hardware and software, as it were, going on. If the humans fighting it are the sort of software and innovating in the training and techniques, it's not unknown for a country that looked like it was incrementally winning, as Germany was, say, in 1918, on the battlefield, for that battlefield effort to completely collapse or become unsustainable because the economics that fuel it are unsustainable. Do you see eventually it going this way? And who's more resilient in that respect? Russia or Ukraine? Who can keep slogging out for longer until their economy no longer has the energy to continue?
Well, fundamentally, I think Ukraine has the stronger backers. And I think this is what Trump doesn't understand, what Putin doesn't understand, and what also a number of European leaders don't quite comprehend yet. But for the European countries, it's ultimately not acceptable that Ukraine loses this war. We can talk about what would winning look like, but Ukraine has to come out of this in a pretty good shape. For European security, that's absolutely important. So I don't really see it as an option for the European countries to let Ukraine lose. And that means that the support will have to continue, and the European countries will have to find the resources that are necessary to meet that end. And that means that also, I think, ultimately, that is how this is going to end, that Russia will be running out of resources. Um, and it will become evident that this is not going anywhere for them. And then there are many ways that that could play out, ranging from this becoming some kind of frozen conflict to a larger collapse on the Russian side. Um, but I think ultimately Ukraine has the stronger backers. But we also have to, you mentioned World War II. I mean, we also have to remember how long time that took. I think from 1942 or around
Mm.
there and
World War
forward,
One
it
as
was
well, same period, 14 to
yeah,
18, another 4 year period. Yeah.
4 year period. Yeah, but I think from 1942, it was probably clear that Germany was going to lose this war, and then it just took another 3 years before it actually happened. Yeah, so it can take a long time, when countries lose wars in because they run out of resources.
That, of course, is concerning because it's only now that it seems that Russia is reaching that point almost of no return there. But it still has the ability to channel resources. And if North Korea weighs in with, first it was 10,000 troops, and people were saying, "Oh, it's terrible, but it's only 10,000." That 10,000 helped them to regain Kursk. I'm not sure if they could have done it without that. Then you have now 30,000 new ones being announced. It's highly likely that these troops will no longer just fight on the territory of Russia. It's entirely possible that these will start fighting on the territory of Ukraine as well. And my guess is, well, if they can send 10,000, they can send 30,000. If they can send 30,000, they can send 300,000. What are we going to do if Putin is stuck on an escalatory cycle? And let's face it, so far he fits that pattern. It's like a tank with one forward gear, and that gear is escalate to every, perceived escalation or reaction of your adversary. In that sense, where could this go? Especially with allies like North Korea and possibly China as well.
Oh, let's be fair. I mean, both sides are escalating. I think Ukraine is also doing what they can to make things more and more intense. And if we look at how the war is playing out now, then I think the biggest escalation is probably actually on the Ukrainian side with the long range strikes that they can conduct now and the last year not at all to the same extent. I think the whole war is in a phase of escalation, and I think this is going to continue for quite a while. And I will actually say one of the things that makes me sort of most concerned about the biggest escalation scenarios is actually if things start being really tough for Russia. If it becomes clear that Russia is on a path to losing, then I think Putin will be willing to do more desperate things to turn things around. And so I mean, I'm among those who are actually concerned that we might see a Russian test of Article 5 while this war in Ukraine is still going on. I know many people say that there's no way Russia could do that. They would have to end the war in Ukraine, rebuild their forces before they would be ready for that. I think we might see them doing something dramatic like that if it becomes clear that they are on a path to losing, just because Putin will do whatever it takes to not lose. And he doesn't really care if he loses a little or if he loses a lot. Might as well go all in here and try to do something to make us realize that we can't keep on supporting Ukraine because we need whatever resources we're giving to Ukraine. We need them for our own defense and those things. So I think actually, there are many things in terms of escalation that could happen still in this war. And I think the war is going to continue escalating geographically, but also just in terms of what types of equipment we're seeing, what targets will be hit, and those things. And of course, the North Koreans are also a part of that. Which countries are involved? I also think it would be unwise to rule out the possibility of some of Ukraine's supporters also getting involved in this. I don't know if we're going to talk about the whole Sky Shield thing and
Yes, that
what's
was
the
going to be the last question
okay.
there. But no, I tend, having read Putin over a number of years, unfortunately, I agree with you that by no means this is over, and actually, he doesn't have the same restrictions in mind that we do. All he has is his survival and victory, and nothing is off the table except if he sees the cost as being too high. But unfortunately, we're not articulating the costs of these things, and we're not showing any determination to impose those kind of costs. And the US is doing the opposite. It's lifting the penalties that were originally imposed. It seems that a whole bunch of Russian banks have just had sanctions lifted by the US, including their munitions trading bank, which again is like a shocking piece of symbolism there, but also gives a real advantage to Putin. No, I think either sub-threshold tests or even a full Article 5 test is certainly not off the table. Absolutely. The remedy to that is going to be really, the last question is what should we be doing? If fully forcing Russia out of Ukraine would be seen as something that provokes a huge escalation on their part, should we not be at least trying to ensure some kind of very high cost on Russia for its continued aggression, and make sure that the lines of contact have absolute stasis? One of those ideas, of course, is Sky Shield. Protect Ukrainian civilians, take back control of the skies. You don't get into dogfights with Russia. You don't sort of, take that and extend it out over Donetsk and Luhansk, but you do make it very, very clear that we're not prepared to let Ukraine fall. What are your views on that? And of course, the military practicability of such a step.
I think we're back to the question of Europe needing to take leadership here and not all the time expecting the Americans to do something because they're not going to do it. So if we have interests in a certain outcome in this war, we have to start building that future. And if we envision a future where Ukraine is in some kind of military alliance with us, which I see as super important for us, not just for Ukraine, but really important for us if we want to be able to stand up to Russia in the future without necessarily the support of the United States. We absolutely need Ukraine to be part of that alliance with us. So if we want to build that future, then we have to do that. We have to normalize the idea of European soldiers on the ground in Ukraine, for example. Not fighting forces. I don't think any European capital would be ready to do that now. But we have to normalize the idea of European forces being in Ukraine. And that could be Sky Shield. That could be this thing about, protecting the skies, doing something, but start actually doing something instead of what we've seen so far, a lot of talk about peacekeeping forces once the war is over and with an American backstop and all these things that just, it's silly discussions about a future that might not come, right? But I think we need to start seeing some leadership on this and someone making those decisions and normalizing the idea that this is just how things are and that Putin should not get any idea of rolling that back. Once we built a training mission in Ukraine with Western soldiers there, and we make it clear that they're not going anywhere. This is a permanent thing from now on. Then Putin will have to somehow, take that into account and start thinking about, okay, maybe I'm actually not getting what I want out of this. Maybe something else would be a better approach or what have you. Maybe I better stop this war before it gets even worse. Who knows? I don't know. Just we need European countries to start taking some initiative here. I think that's the better way forward. Unfortunately, I don't really see it that much happening right now. So I think the more likely thing is we're just going to keep supporting Ukraine the way we have, which might also work, but which I actually think is more dangerous in the long run because it means that this escalatory spiral that we're in is allowed to run for longer.
That's right, and we can see that Putin is absolutely not prepared to get off that escalatory merry-go-round, and he's had the escalation initiative, I think I call it, escalation initiative throughout the conflict. We have always, or mostly, been reactive. There's only a few instances where we've struck in ways that he hadn't expected, and that didn't unleash Armageddon. Rather, it made Russia think a little bit, but not for long because we fell back into our slightly sort of predictable and slightly appeasing ways. I'm thinking of being unpredictable. When we hit the Black Sea Fleet headquarters, that was an extraordinary moment of drama, extraordinary moment of strength and symbolism. And but there have been far too few of those instances where Europe has shown backbone, as it were, against Russian aggression. So on the whole, relatively pessimistic, I think. I think this is a relatively negative outlook here. Given that Ukraine is still there in the fight, they still have extraordinary spirit to fight, and they still have an extraordinary amount of innovation that's helped them remain in this fight. Are you still hopeful that Ukraine will not lose, incrementally that much territory from this point on, but it will suffer, unfortunately, a lot more trauma and damage?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, let's not end it on a too pessimistic note. I think overall, I think time is still on Ukraine's side. As I said, because Ukraine has the strongest backers in this, and I also see the boom in the Ukrainian defense industry is really important in Ukraine's ability to keep on going here, and it's actually working. Like Russia is in the middle of a summer offensive, and so far it's been a failure. It's hard to, find other words for whatever the Russians are doing right now. Well, we're only halfway through the summer. It might, things can still happen, but there's no way. And I don't see them being able to significantly alter sort of the basic dynamics in the war. Once we get on the other side of this Russian summer offensive, there will still be two armies facing each other. The Ukrainians they will probably lose some square kilometers here and there, but overall, it will still be a fighting Ukrainian army, and the Russians will have will not have achieved all that much progress. And um, I think we're still on a trajectory as where things are gradually shifting in Ukraine's direction. As I said, right now we see Ukraine being able to conduct large airstrikes deep into Russia, which is something they couldn't do a year ago. A year from now, that will be even more. That balance is shifting, right? But it's frustrating, obviously, when we look at how the Americans are behaving here. If we had seen continued American support for Ukraine, I think 2025 would have been the year where the direction on the front line would have shifted. Yeah, we would have seen Ukraine starting to push back the Russians. Now that is unlikely to happen anytime soon, unfortunately. So obviously, it's frustrating, but I think it's just delaying things, and ultimately, I'm still optimistic for Ukraine.
That's good. That's good. Again, I completely aligned with you on that. Having seen some of the things that are some of the preparations and some of the extraordinary skills that are being displayed there, and the video this evening, which is a great one with a guy called Dima Zloshchenko, who is in the unmanned systems forces, and his wife runs one of the most effective drone charities. The spirit and scale of that civic society is really going to and is giving Russia a real test, and hopefully will hold it at bay. For now, Anders, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure speaking once again, and we've covered a huge amount of ground, and we ended up in a relatively more positive place despite the dark beginnings of the episode.
Well, thanks again. It's always a pleasure.